The will was the first thing people whispered about, before the hospital room, before the silence, before the machines that had once breathed rhythm into a fading life. In the final pages of George Clooney's legacy, one name was missing. Not crossed out in anger, not explained in careful legal language, just absent. And that absence spoke louder than anything else. It stirred questions that no one dared to ask aloud, because long before the world saw the dignified aging icon, before the silver hair and quiet interviews, there had been fractures, deep, invisible ones, etched into a life that never fully healed. Years earlier, the night of the accident had arrived without warning. A road too quiet, a curve taken too fast, and a silence that followed that no father could ever escape. Ella Clooney, his daughter, the one who had inherited his eyes and, they said, his stubborn way of loving, was gone before the sirens even reached the scene. The impact didn't just end a life, it shattered something inside him that never quite reassembled. Those close to him would later say that from that night on, he began to live in fragments. He would still smile, still appear on red carpets, still charm audiences with that familiar ease, but there was always a pause behind his gaze, as if part of him had remained on that empty stretch of road. And then there was the love story no one could define, a relationship that stretched across years, across cities, across silences. It was never confirmed, never denied, just existing in the background like a melody only he could hear. Friends spoke of late-night phone calls, of letters that were never sent, of moments when he would leave a room simply because a certain name had been mentioned. It was not a love that ended. It was a love that never found a place to land. And perhaps that was worse. Because unfinished things have a way of lingering, of echoing through decisions, through regrets, through the quiet spaces of a man's final years. As he grew older, the world saw a legend settling into peace. Interviews became softer. Appearances became rarer. The once constant presence of cameras began to fade, replaced by longer stretches of absence. But those who truly watched, those who paid attention to the details, noticed the shift. The way his hands would tremble slightly when he thought no one was looking. The way he lingered just a little too long before answering simple questions. The way silence became his most frequent companion. In those final years, time did not rush him. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if giving him space to revisit everything he had tried to forget. Old photographs resurfaced. Voices from the past returned in unexpected ways. And always, there was that unspoken weight, the kind that doesn't demand attention but refuses to disappear. The will, when it was eventually revealed, did not clarify anything. It complicated everything. One child remembered, one child erased. No explanation, no closure. Just a decision that seemed to mirror the contradictions of the man himself, capable of immense love, yet marked by choices that left even those closest to him searching for meaning. Some said it was deliberate. Others insisted it was a mistake. But those who understood him, even slightly, knew better. Nothing about him had ever been accidental, because his life, despite its glamour, had never followed a straight line. It curved, it fractured, it circled back on itself. The tragedies were not isolated events. They were threads woven into everything that followed. The loss of Ella was not just a memory. It was a presence. The unfinished love was not just a story. It was a shadow. And the will. It was not just a document. It was a final, silent statement that raised more questions than it answered. Even in the end, even as age wrapped itself around him and the world began to prepare for the inevitable, there was no sense of resolution. No clear narrative, just pieces, moments, glimpses of a life that had been lived intensely, imperfectly, and, perhaps, incompletely. And somewhere within all of it, the missing name remained. The reading of the will did not end the silence. It shattered it. What had once been contained within sealed envelopes and private conversations began to spill outward, into courtrooms, into headlines, into whispered conversations that stretched far beyond the family itself. The estate, valued at nearly $1 billion, was no longer just a number. It became a battlefield, a quiet war, fought not with raised voices, but with documents, with signatures, with the careful unraveling of a life that had been deliberately kept out of reach. At first, it seemed simple. Assets divided, properties listed, foundations named. But then, a line appeared, one that no one had expected. A name. Not the one the public knew, not the one that had been discussed in the days following his passing. A different name. One that did not belong in the version of the family the world had been allowed to see. And that was when everything began to shift. Because the moment that name surfaced, the past, long buried, carefully avoided, started to move again. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Old documents were revisited. Old photographs were taken out of drawers that had not been opened in years. Conversations that had once ended in silence now stretched longer, heavier, more uncertain. There were questions no one had prepared answers for. Who was this person? Why had they been included? And more importantly, why had they been hidden? Those closest to George Clooney began to realize that the man they thought they knew had lived more than one life. Not in the sense of deception, but in layers. Carefully constructed layers. Public, private, and something else. Something that existed in the spaces between. There were rumors, quiet at first, then louder. Stories of a relationship that predated everything the public had ever seen. A connection that had never been acknowledged, never confirmed, but never entirely denied either. Some said it was a child. Others said it was a promise, a responsibility left unfinished, a truth postponed until it could no longer be contained. And then came the records. Not dramatic, not obvious, just small inconsistencies. Dates that didn't quite align. Names that appeared briefly, then disappeared. Financial movements that seemed insignificant on their own, but when placed together, began to form a pattern. A pattern that suggested something far more complex than anyone had imagined. The dispute over the inheritance intensified, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Control over a narrative. Ownership of a truth. Each side believed they understood him. Each side believed they had the right to define what his life had meant. But the truth refused to stay in one place. It moved. From lawyers to journalists. From private files to public speculation. From silence into something else entirely. And as more fragments surfaced, a different picture began to take shape. Not of a man divided, but of a man who had carried something unresolved, across decades. Something he had protected, perhaps at the cost of clarity, at the cost of understanding, at the cost of those left behind to make sense of it all. Because this was no longer just about a will. It was about a family that had never fully known itself, generations connected by blood, yet separated by secrets. Conversations that should have happened years ago, now forced into existence when it was already too late. The kind of revelations that don't arrive all at once, but in pieces, each one altering the meaning of the last. And at the center of it all, still, that name, unfamiliar, unexplained, unavoidable. It lingered in every discussion, in every document, in every glance exchanged across rooms filled with people who suddenly felt like strangers to one another. Because the inheritance was never just about wealth, it was about truth. And the moment that truth began to surface, it became clear. This was not the story of a man. It was the story of a family that had been waiting for decades to be revealed. Before the silence, before the fractured family, before the name that no one could explain, there was the image, the one the world never questioned, the one that seemed complete. George Clooney was not just a man who appeared on screen. He was a presence, a face that had, for decades, lived inside living rooms, cinema halls, late-night reruns, quiet Sunday afternoons. People did not simply watch him. They grew accustomed to him, trusted him, as if his voice, his timing, his steady gaze belonged to something familiar, something stable. He moved through Hollywood like someone who understood its language without needing to speak loudly. Dozens of films, roles that shifted from charm to intensity, from humor to something darker, more restrained. Each performance carried a kind of effortlessness that was difficult to define. Not loud, not exaggerated, just controlled. There were nights when his name would be announced, and the room would already know. There were moments when the camera would find him, and it did not need to adjust, because he had already learned how to exist within the frame. Over time, the work accumulated, not just in numbers, but in weight. Projects that stretched across genres, across decades. Behind the camera, in front of it. Decisions made not only as an actor, but as someone who understood power. How to shape it, how to hold it, how to step away from it at the exact moment it became too much. And with that came something else. Control. Not just over scripts or scenes, but over an empire that quietly expanded beyond what most people could see. Investments, properties, partnerships that did not carry his face, but carried his influence. A network of decisions that, piece by piece, built a fortune large enough to outlive him. Nearly $1 billion, an amount that sounded abstract when spoken aloud, but felt very real when written into documents, into signatures, into the will that would later divide everything. To the public, it looked like success in its purest form. A man who had navigated fame without losing himself. A figure who aged with dignity, who chose his appearances carefully, who never seemed desperate for attention. Even his absences felt intentional, as if he understood that presence was not about being seen constantly, but about being remembered at the right moments. And he was remembered. Across continents, across generations, his face became part of a shared memory, something that linked people who had never met, who lived in different countries, spoke different languages, but recognized the same expression, the same voice, the same quiet confidence. But that was only one version of him, because behind the image, polished, consistent, admired, there were fractures that the camera never captured. The pauses that were edited out, the silences between interviews, the moments when the performance ended, but the weight remained. It is easy to believe that someone who controls so much, career, reputation, wealth, must also control everything else. That success, when it reaches a certain scale, creates stability. That a man who can command an industry can also command his own life. But the truth, as it began to surface after his passing, suggested something very different. Because while he was building an empire, something else was quietly unraveling. While audiences saw a man who seemed complete, there were parts of him that remained unresolved. While his name carried authority in boardrooms, in studios, in headlines, there were spaces in his life where his voice had never been fully heard. And that is where the contrast begins to take shape. Not between success and failure, but between what was visible and what was never allowed to be seen. The world knew the icon, the films, the awards, the wealth, the legacy. But the man behind it, the one who carried loss, who held on to unfinished love, who made decisions that would later confuse even those closest to him. remained just out of reach, as if he had spent an entire lifetime mastering how to be seen, without ever being fully understood. 4 threads began to surface, quietly at first, almost hidden beneath the noise of legal arguments and public speculation. But the more people looked, the more it became clear. Everything that had happened, everything that was still unfolding, seemed to circle around these 4 unresolved points. Not answers, not conclusions, just fragments, each one incomplete on its own. But together, they formed something heavier, something that refused to be ignored. The first was a conversation, not recorded, not confirmed, but remembered. It was said to have taken place just hours before the accident. The one that took Ella's life. A phone call. Brief. Ordinary, at least on the surface. A father asking if she had arrived. A daughter replying with something simple, something casual, something that no one would ever think to preserve. And yet, those who claimed to know spoke of a pause at the end of the call. A hesitation. As if one of them almost said something more, but didn't. No one could agree on the exact words, but everyone agreed on one thing. It was the last time they spoke, and that absence, the things left unsaid, seemed to echo far louder than anything that had actually been spoken. The second was the will, not just its value, not just the billion-dollar weight it carried, but its structure, the way it divided, the way it included, the way it excluded. To outsiders, it looked like a legal document, precise, calculated, final. But to those inside the family it felt uneven. Certain names appeared where they were expected, others appeared where they were not. And then there were the absences, the spaces where names should have been, but weren't. It wasn't just about who received what. It was about what the distribution suggested. Priorities, regrets, possibly even apologies. Some believed the will was his final attempt to correct something. Others believed it was proof that he never truly resolved it at all. Either way, it did not settle anything. It opened everything. The third thread came from someone who had been there. Not in the spotlight, not in interviews, but in the background. A presence that had followed George Clooney through years that the public never fully saw. This person did not speak immediately. In fact, for a long time, they said nothing at all. But when they finally did, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful, measured, and somehow more unsettling because of it. They spoke of patterns, of habits, of moments when he would withdraw without explanation, of nights when he would revisit the same photographs, the same messages, the same memories, over and over again, as if searching for something that could no longer be found. They did not claim to understand him. They did not offer clear answers. But they confirmed one thing. He never moved on. Not completely. And the fourth was the most difficult to define, because it wasn't a document. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't even something that could be proven in the traditional sense. It was a pattern, a repetition, a quiet influence that seemed to shape decisions long after the loss itself had occurred. Investments that aligned with places connected to Ella. Projects chosen or abandoned without explanation. Moments where his reactions felt disproportionate, as if something deeper had been triggered beneath the surface. Individually, these things meant very little. But together, they suggested something else entirely. That the daughter he had lost was not just a memory. She was a presence, not in a literal sense, not something that could be pointed to or explained, but something that existed within every choice he made afterward. As if, in losing her, he had not let go, but instead carried her forward, allowing that absence to guide him in ways even he might not have fully understood. And when these 4 threads are placed side by side, the final conversation, the will, the testimony, the pattern, they do not resolve the story. They complicate it, because each one raises a question that leads to another. Each one opens a door that does not close, and somewhere between them, just beyond what can be confirmed, just beyond what can be proven, there is a version of the truth that remains incomplete, waiting, not to be explained, but to be uncovered, before the fame, before the carefully controlled image, before the silence that would later surround his final years. There was a beginning that did not look like destiny. It looked like instability. The story, when traced backward, does not open with cameras or applause. It opens in places that do not stay the same for long. Rooms that are temporary. Addresses that change before they can feel familiar. A childhood shaped not by a single home, but by movement. Constant, uncertain, sometimes abrupt. George Clooney was not born into the version of life the world would later associate with his name. The early years were marked by absence more than presence, not just of money, but of certainty, of grounding, of something stable enough to lean on. There are stories, fragmented, inconsistent, but persistent, that speak of a father who was not always there in the way a child needs. Not necessarily gone, but distant in a way that feels harder to define. A presence that did not fully recognize, did not fully claim, did not fully anchor. And for a child, that kind of absence is not loud. It is quiet. It settles slowly. It teaches something without words. That nothing is guaranteed. That belonging can shift. That love, if it exists, is not always something you can hold on to. And so, survival becomes a skill long before it should. Not survival in the dramatic sense, but in the small, everyday adjustments that shape a person over time. Learning how to read a room quickly. Learning when to speak and when to stay silent. Learning how to adapt before being asked to. These are not things that are taught directly. They are absorbed, repeated, internalized until they become instinct. There were no clear paths then, no defined direction, just a series of moments that required response, movement, adjustment. And within that constant shifting, something began to form, a way of navigating the world that relied not on stability, but on control. Because when the outside world cannot be controlled, you begin to build control within yourself. You choose what to reveal. You choose what to hide. You learn how to present a version of yourself that fits the moment, even if it does not reflect everything beneath it. And over time, that becomes second nature. The child who moved from place to place becomes the adult who knows how to exist anywhere. The child who lacked certainty becomes the adult who creates it, carefully, deliberately, sometimes even rigidly. The child who learned not to depend too fully on others becomes the adult who carries things alone, even when he no longer has to. These are not dramatic transformations. They are gradual, almost invisible. But they shape everything that comes after, because the patterns established early do not disappear. They evolve. They resurface in different forms, in relationships that never fully settle, in decisions that prioritize control over vulnerability, in the need to manage not just a career, but an entire life, down to the smallest detail. And perhaps most importantly, in the way loss is processed. Because when someone who has spent a lifetime building control is faced with something that cannot be controlled, the impact is different, deeper, more disorienting. The loss of Ella was not just a tragedy. It was a disruption of something he had spent decades constructing. A system, a balance, a way of holding everything together. And when that system breaks, it does not simply return to what it was before. It reveals what was always underneath. The instability, the absence, the early lessons that never fully left. So when people look at the later years, the silence, the decisions, the will that raised more questions than answers, they often try to find a single explanation. A moment. A turning point. But the truth does not begin there. It begins much earlier, in the spaces where nothing seemed significant at the time, in the quiet adjustments of a child learning how to exist without certainty. in the slow formation of a person who would one day appear to have everything, while still carrying the imprint of a beginning that had never been fully resolved. And once that imprint is there, it does not fade. It waits. It shapes. It returns in ways no one, not even him, could completely escape. Somewhere between those early years of instability and the first moment he realized people were watching him, not just seeing but recognizing, a quiet decision began to take shape. It wasn't spoken. It wasn't written down. It didn't arrive as a clear sentence in his mind. But it was there, a promise. Not to anyone else, but to himself. Because when a child grows up learning that presence can disappear without warning, that affection can feel conditional, that belonging can shift from one moment to the next, something begins to harden. Not visibly, not in a way others can easily point to, but internally, structurally. A kind of vow forms. If I become someone they cannot ignore, if I build something too large to be left behind, if I make myself essential, then I will never feel that absence again. For George Clooney, that vow did not look like desperation. It did not push him into reckless ambition or loud declarations. Instead, it expressed itself in something far more controlled, more precise: consistency, discipline, an almost quiet determination to rise, not suddenly, not chaotically, but steadily. He learned early that attention could be unpredictable, so he did not chase attention. He built presence, the kind that stays, the kind that does not depend on a single moment, but accumulates over time. Film by film, decision by decision, relationship by relationship, until eventually it becomes something larger than the individual moments that created it. And with each step forward, the promise deepened, not consciously, but persistently, because success, for him, was never just about achievement. It was about security. Not financial security, though that came. Not even professional security, though that too became undeniable. It was something more personal, emotional. The need to create a life where nothing and no one could simply disappear without consequence, where absence would no longer define the structure of his world, where he would be the one who decides what stays and what leaves. That is why control became so central, not in an obvious way, not as dominance or force, but as careful management of image, of choices, of access, of distance. He did not let everything in. He did not reveal everything. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that to maintain the life he was building, he had to regulate what could reach him. Because if everything is open, everything can be lost. And he had already learned what that felt like. So the promise continued to guide him. In the roles he accepted, in the opportunities he declined, in the way he positioned himself, not just as an actor, but as a figure. Someone whose influence extended beyond the screen, into spaces where decisions shaped outcomes, where presence carried weight. He was no longer the child moving from place to place. He was the one creating the place, designing it, securing it, ensuring that it could not be taken away. And yet, within that promise, there was something fragile, because the very thing he was trying to avoid, being left, being disconnected, being forced into absence, cannot always be controlled. No matter how carefully a life is built, no matter how much influence is accumulated, no matter how visible, how respected, how established a person becomes, there are still moments that do not follow structure. Loss does not negotiate. Absence does not ask permission. And when those moments arrive, they do not just challenge the promise. They expose it. They reveal how much of a life has been shaped around something that was never fully resolved. So when Ella was gone, it was not just grief. It was the collapse of something he had believed, for years, he could prevent. The realization that even after everything he had built, there were still things he could not hold on to. And in that realization, the promise did not disappear. It tightened. It deepened. It changed shape. No longer just about avoiding abandonment, but about holding on to what remained. even if that meant making decisions that others could not understand. Even if that meant creating distance where closeness once existed. Even if that meant rewriting the final chapter of his life in a way that would leave behind more questions than answers. Because a promise like that, once formed, does not simply fade, it continues, quietly, relentlessly, shaping everything until the very end.